Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Philosophy and Social Change 3 conference. This is session 4, Moral Appraisal of Behavior as Disability Access Ethics. My name is Cecilia Moon, and I am a disabled philosopher who is currently a visiting instructor at Purdue University. My primary area of research is the philosophy of emotion and includes interest in the philosophy of mind, ontology, epistemology, ethics, and feminist philosophy. Although my research is not squarely in the philosophy of disability, as a disabled philosopher, I like to support projects that support my community. I'm an Asian woman, and I am wearing a winter sweater and tortoiseshell glasses. I am sitting in my home office with plants and a reading chair with a flower throw knitted by my mother on it. And I'd now like to introduce our speaker. Our speaker is August Gorman. August is a disabled analytic philosopher of disability and an assistant professor of philosophy at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. They are a non-binary trans man who uses he and they pronouns. His research attempts to reframe traditional debates in moral responsibility and the philosophy of death by confronting them through the lens of the lived reality of neurodivergent experience. He is currently working on a book project called Altering the Fault Lines: How Neurodiversity Reshapes Moral Responsibility. August is a white man with short dark hair, a beard, and wire-framed glasses. They are wearing a polo shirt and sitting in a home office with household items behind them. August?
Thank you so much, Cecilia. And thank you so much to Shelley and to Joe for having me here. I am very excited to be at this conference presenting again. It's just a really wonderful conference that I look forward to each year. So with that, I'm going to share my slides. Okay, here we go. So my talk today is on moral appraisal as disability access ethics. And my plan for this talk is to do two things. So first, I want to show why we cannot have an ethics of blame or appraisal without thinking about disability. And second, I want to explain why what we need to fill this gap is an ethics of access specifically, and sort of set the agenda for the kind of disability access ethics that I think we would need. So I'm not going to be able to completely do this ethics of access, but I'm going to try to do some agenda setting. Okay, so to begin, our interpersonal interactions often involve assessments of what other people's behavior expresses about their attitudes towards us. We get angry or make assumptions about the type of person someone is when they run late, because we take it to mean that they do not sufficiently care about us. We hire people who make eye contact because we take it to be a sign that they are listening to us respectfully. While these practices may to some seem commonsensical, these sorts of interpretational inferences unjustly assume that everyone is neurotypical. That is, that they are psychologically constituted in a way that is assumed by the majority to be the quote unquote normal way to operate. For example, it is easier for many autistic people to listen when not making eye contact, and running late may not reveal anything more about a person with ADHD than the fact that she missed a dose of Ritalin. So the idea that we appraise people's behavior as an expression of their attitudes about us also plays an important role in theories of moral responsibility. The idea is that when we praise or blame someone for their behavior, we do so in a way that takes their behavior to have expressed some further thing about them. So behavior for which we're responsible is appraisable on the basis of what it expresses. Something like this is part of several prominent kinds of views in the moral responsibility literature. There are some important differences that I'll mostly gloss over here today for the sake of time, but I'll just sort of briefly mention what some of these views are. So first, we have self-disclosure views, such as the one advocated by Harry Frankfurt. These views posit that when a person acts agentially, she identifies with elements of her psychology that then determine her behavior. So in intentionally acting on the basis of, say, a commitment, her resultant action is expressive of the value she places on that commitment. On another kind of view, conversational views, like the view of Michael McKenna, These views see a person's moral behavior as making a sort of conversational move for which things like blame, excuse, praise, and so on are potential expressive responses. So these views will need to have some way to make inferences from a person's behavior to some sort of expressive content. And finally, we have what we might call attributionist views. Here we have views like Angela Smith's view that a person's behavior is always reflective of their judgment-sensitive attitudes or their evaluative judgments or their moral personality in some sort of way. These views really prioritize the ability of agents to morally protest actions which seem to indicate a lack of care. Now, in my view, it is my view that we make these sorts of attributions that people's behavior expresses something about them quite broadly. But I think it's kind of easiest to see and it's most explicit in cases of responsibility for omission. So consider the example where someone forgets to call you on your birthday. This is an example Angela Smith likes to use. So you might think to yourself, ugh, she must not care about me as much as I thought, because if she cared about me, then she would have remembered my birthday. In this way, you take her omission to in some way reveal or reflect or express or communicate something about her. Now, one thing we might mean by this is that we asked her to write down our birthday in her calendar because we know she tends to forget, and you explained how important it was, told her to set a phone reminder. That's kind of a different story. But another thing we might mean is just the bare fact of forgetting somehow implies her lack of care. And I want to raise a problem with making this leap too quickly. So let's first get a bit clearer about the kind of thing that I want to put some pressure on. We might call it this: direct responsibility for the attitudes that your omissions express. Okay, so to contrast, we have what we might call derivative responsibility for omissions. So when someone is derivatively responsible for an omission, they're responsible for what they don't do because of or in light of some earlier thing that they did do that led to the omission. That's sometimes referred to in this literature as the benighting act. So here are some standard cases to get the idea. A person drives while intoxicated and hits a mailbox. It seems that when we blame that person, it's not primarily for the driving decision made right at that moment when they approach the mailbox under the influence. Instead, we're really blaming them for an earlier decision to drink without a plan to get home safely or something like that. Another standard case of derivative responsibility could be a person who acts out of some sort of factual ignorance, but their ignorance is due to intentionally failing to educate themselves. So we're not thinking that a surgeon's wrong choice during surgery is directly revealing of some sort of character flaw, but if they spent their time before surgery playing a video game instead of learning the right surgical technique that they had to do, then we might think that that choice reveals something about them. So the mistaken surgery reveals something only via that earlier act. And some people think that all cases of omission are going to be explicable in this kind of way. We're tracing it to a prior thing. So that's one view. But in contrast to that whole view, we now can talk about non-derivative responsibility for omissions. And this idea that people are actually directly responsible for these kinds of omissions without being blameworthy for an earlier benighting act has lately been gaining a lot of traction. So these views kind of come in two flavors. One version is the view that we can directly read someone's quality of will off of their behavior, like forgetting or not attending to something. And another version of the view says, rather than the fact that we could directly read something about their quality of will off of their behavior, it's fair to take a person's omission as a signal of their quality of will. In other words, it's fair to act as if that's their quality of will unless you somehow get more evidence or are told otherwise. So to summarize, This view encourages you to make the inference that a person's failure to act means that they've failed to care, either because it's direct proof that they don't care, or because it makes it so that you are in a position to reasonably assume that they fail to care. And either way, it's proposed that there's sort of a simple algorithm that brings you from the failure to act to the failure to care. But I think we ought to be much more cautious in our interpretive inferences of this kind. So to put a sort of slogan to it, failure to act does not equal failure to care. Now, the relationship between failure to act and failure to care, I want to say, is not equivalent, and there's no simple algorithm. Now, is there some correlation between failing to act in certain circumstances and perhaps that person has failed to sufficiently care? There might be some sort of correlation here. But you have to remember, and I think this is the key, individual people have differences in things like memory, executive functioning, patterning of attention. And if that's right, there just couldn't be a one-size-fits-all simple algorithm that takes you from failure to act to failure to care. So I briefly want to take a look at a question, which is this: why would we have ever thought there could be some general thing we could say about when someone's failure to act means that they failed to care? And I have much more to say about this in some of my other work, but I did want to just briefly touch on two things that I think may have been factors in getting us here. So first off, the moral responsibility literature has for a long time been invested in coming up with ways to treat people with psychological disabilities as outlier non-agents who we can sort of safely excise from our theories about relating and reacting to one another. Their behavior might not mean what most people's does, according to this thought, but that's because their behavior doesn't mean anything at all. With the outliers out of the way, we can then make generalizations about agents, right? Once we have taken the confusing cases out. I think that is a problem. Second, I think that we end up with a bit of a feedback loop. Now, here's what I mean by that. There's pressure to mask the ways in which our neurodivergent behavior does not, in fact, correlate to the inferences that are made about it. So we attempt to indirectly manage and modify what we do with a kind of almost double consciousness. So there's both what we do actually means, and there's what others are likely to think that it means about us. And the more we attempt to line up our behavior to mimic neurotypical patterns of behavior, the more invisible our differences become, and the more we internalize the level of struggle that it takes to do this on a daily basis, it becomes hidden labor. We end up with the norm that, for example, eye contact means respectfully listening, except for those outliers who can't control themselves. The balancing act of actually listening and focusing on making eye contact so that your interlocutor interprets you as listening, all of which you do because you care about your interlocutor and because you care about your interlocutor, thinking that you respect them, all of that internal sort of work is invisibilized and it doesn't end up making it into the philosophical theorizing. So I've explained how there's a popular view that we can be directly responsible for our omissions because they directly reveal our cares, and argued that this is a fairly absurd view that we would only ever think could be right because disabled people are cast aside as non-agents and there's pressure to mask that leads to a kind of feedback loop. Okay, well, I do want to back up here for a moment, though, and consider a possible rejoinder to some of what I've said that I imagine some people might have. They might say, no, August, failure to act does indicate a failure to care, but people just have a lot of excuses. And these are excuses that are reasonable. So, for example, you might think, look, it is reasonable to take failing to act as expressing failure to care enough unless that person lets you know that actually, oh, it's just I have a bad short-term memory, or, oh, I'm just bad at focusing, or I have trouble keeping up as well as I should. Lately, I have bad long-term memory. I'm just not good at being on time. I'm not good at following through so much lately, etc. But what I want you to notice is that these kinds of excuses have some sort of normative standard that's implied, that's not being met, and it largely goes unspecified in this discourse. So a question that I think we need to ask here is, where do these normative standards come from? What makes it so that one person's behavior needs an excuse and another's doesn't? So if we lived in a world where everyone had, say, a much lower working memory capacity than the average person currently does, would we be less likely to make these same kinds of inferences? Would we be less likely to require certain kinds of excuses? And once you start thinking that way, I think you come to realize that oftentimes it's just minoritized forms of agential functioning that are counted as needing excuses simply because they're in the minority. When that's the case, that's a form of marginalization that we shouldn't just be accepting into our theory about moral appraisal. This form of marginalization, once you conceptualize it in the way that I'm suggesting you should, may in fact remind you of another form of marginalization: the design of spaces and social environments in ways that just do not take disabled people into account. This, I want to argue, is no coincidence. So having norms for the appraisal of behavior in interpersonal contexts that assumes that everyone is neurotypical, I want to argue, just is a way that our social life is inaccessible. And so what we really need here is to reshape our norms using principles of disability access ethics. Perhaps when put in a certain light, this should be no surprise, because this is an instance of the fact that, as Anita Silvers puts it, working towards genuine accessibility will involve, quote, profound transformation of the core conventions that regulate our social interactions, and our practices of behavioral interpretation and moral appraisal are certainly part of those core conventions. Now, I think this makes perfect sense, but when you step back and think about it for a moment, I think I'm actually making quite a bold claim here. So the bold claim here is this: you actually can't do moral responsibility and the ethics of blame without thinking about disability access. Okay, now the second bold, but maybe slightly less bold claim that I want to make here is that disability access ethics isn't easy. And we're actually going to have to develop some conceptual tools and theories to be able to sort it out. And it's not going to be abundantly clear how we should sort out various questions in disability access. Now, why is that? Why can't we just say access for all and call it a day? So, well, first off, we have some, okay, I want to just touch on two reasons, I guess, that we have a need for an ethics of disability access, and that it's not going to be super simple. So first off, we have some reasons to delineate the boundaries of what counts as an access need. If we depathologize disability and neurodivergence, we're left without an obvious way to distinguish access requests from non-neurodiversity related bids to change some sort of aspect of social space based on a strong run-of-the-mill aversion or preference. So nevertheless, we tend to think that requests that are genuinely disability related should have some sort of privileged status. If that's right, we need to answer questions like, how ought we to think about this difference and demarcate it? What kind of normative weight does the fact that a request is legitimately neurodiversity related or disability related carry with it? It seems like that's an important thing to demarcate, but it's not super obvious how we would go about doing that. Now, another reason that we need to thoroughly develop an ethics of access is that some environments cannot be made simultaneously accessible to all. because the steps that are required to make some aspect of our social life accessible to a certain set of disability needs may conflict with another set of disability access needs. While this realization, just to caveat, this realization is too often used to rationalize inaccessibility, it is also true, I think. Of course, many times such conflicts are merely illusory or contrived, a result of a lack of creativity, understanding, or investment in relevant technologies. Yet, I think even in the most ideal of circumstances, there can be conflicts where what is needed to make some space accessible for one person is precisely the thing that makes the space inaccessible to another person. Examples might include access claims to dim lighting and bright lighting, warmer and cooler room temperatures, the need to stim and misokinesia, a deeply aversive automatic reaction to others' repetitive movements, claims to relax norms about the volume of voices due to an inability to control the volume of one's voice, and hypersensitivities to louder voices. Ultimately, there can be no truly ability neutral environment, one no more advantageous to people with some physical and mental characteristics than others. And so, if we wish to promote disability justice, we'll need to develop tools to help us mediate these inevitable conflicts between incompatible but legitimately disability-based claims for access. I don't think that's going to be an easy task. Now, by the way, these points apply too to thinking about norms of behavioral interpretation and appraisal. There is value in being able to gauge whether someone is listening to you via a commonly accepted signal. But the fact that that interpretational norm causes tremendous barriers for autistic people specifically seems to matter in a way that has special normative significance and weight when we weigh it against non-neurodiversity related concerns. But we can also have norms of behavioral interpretation that advantage certain disabled people and disadvantage others. Now, it's not just the fact that both domains deal with questions about delineating their scope and mediating internal conflicts that make shifting our interpretational norms for behavior and shifting the accessibility of our spaces related tasks. So, there are, I think, a number of integral features that shifting our interpretive norms on appraising behavior share with ethics of access. And the reason, of course, is because I think appraising behavior is just a subspecies of ethics of access. So just to briefly talk through a few of these features, this is by no means a list that includes everything that they share in common, but here are just some of the things that we might borrow from an ethics of access to address this, or in another way of thinking about it, correctly use the lens of ethics of access in order to think through when talking about shifting our behavioral interpretive norms. So first off, in both cases, the lowest hanging fruit is just sort of barrier removal. And barrier removal that is at fairly low cost. So let me explain. So for both, one of the things that we can do is look at some of the lowest hanging fruit. It's just barrier removal. In making our spaces accessible, we can look at things like, do we really need strobe lights in clubs when we know that they cause epileptic seizures in some people? Do we really need to, by that token, have any norm for the behavioral interpretation of eye contact when we're interviewing someone? In both cases, we're in the business of getting rid of barriers that make social situations more accessible when we do so. So no one's giving up anything of great value to get us there. It's just that people haven't really thought about or cared about disabled people enough to make these sorts of modifications. So in both cases, I think we can do a bunch of low-hanging fruit and make changes that, once we center disabled perspectives, become much more obvious that those are clearly the thing to do. So it's not all difficult. I think those are some of the easy things we do. Now, Here are some more difficult questions. So questions about redress and epistemic injustice. So both in disability access ethics and interpreting behavior and shifting those norms, we need to figure out how we want to grapple with the fact that modifying our status quo way of doing things can serve in part as a form of redress to offset harm caused by the way things have been set up historically. Part of what being disabled means is that you inherit the consequences of your identity group having been through a long history of social exclusion and misinterpretation. We don't always know what we need or how we would want to operate under more ideal conditions. And we don't always have the language or the ability to dig ourselves out of our own internalized oppression to see ourselves as deserving of change. So an example I have of this, I have the condition misophonia, where some generally innocuous sounds cause a great deal of traumatic stress. And in some of these misophonia groups that I've seen over the years, you always get people saying something like, we can't expect the world to change for us. You've just got to suck up and deal with it. No one's ever going to stop chewing gum on public transit. This is a you problem, not a them problem, even though, right, they're trying to help other people who are dealing with misophonia. And I think part of that is due to not having the lens to be able to see some of these access needs as legitimate. And I think quite similarly, we could just as easily talk about interpretive norms, even around misophonia. So whether someone, shoots a look at you when you're chewing gum, what we take that to imply about that person. Perhaps there are ways in which we could relax our interpretive norms there. And I think you can maybe see how these two things kind of travel together. I think that's because these norms about appraising behavior are just a species of a kind of access calculation that we need to do. Okay. Another sort of topic that is common to both is the relevance of suffering and/or difficulty changing. So in the ethics of access, we need to grapple with the fact that when two disabled people have competing claims to incompatible access requests, it's just not clear how we should weigh how bad it would be for one person's access request to not be carried out versus the ability or inability someone has to change their need for an access request in some way. Right? There are various factors, and we don't yet have a good way of sorting out how to weigh them against each other. And in a similar vein, I think we can ask questions about behavioral interpretation, like how painful is it to be misinterpreted in a certain kind of way? And how difficult and/or impossible would it be to change so that you do genuinely meet this interpretive norm? These factors apply too to those who we would distribute the burden onto to change their practices of interpretation. One thing that should be admitted is that it can be very difficult to change behavioral interpretive norms. We need to know how to weigh that kind of difficulty against the kind of difficulty disabled people face in meeting norms that don't accurately describe the meaning of their actions. So I think that really parallels, I think, in both discourses. Now, finally, differentiated response and the politics of disclosure. So in promoting disability access, let's say in the classroom, one thing we tend to talk about is differentiated instruction and assessment. So we tailor assignments so that each student has the opportunity to display mastery in a way that suits their particular way of learning. I think a similar approach could help us to be able to more fully appraise one another in a way that's accurate. So we might be able to, once we get to know someone better, we could tailor the way that we're interpreting their action and what we take it to mean about how they feel about us much more once we gain the closeness with someone to be able to understand them better. Now, while withholding judgment about others' behaviors is one way of easing the burdens for those who struggle to meet the current expectations, given our ableist interpretational norms, being able to hold one another accountable via what our behavior expresses about us is socially and politically valuable. This gives us reason, I think, to destigmatize psychological disability and neurodivergence so that disclosure of differences becomes more socially cost-free. The more we are able to learn about neurodivergent experience, the more we'll be able to customize our interpersonal responses in ways that avoid misunderstandings. This way, we can ensure that we're neither judging what shouldn't be judged, nor letting ourselves off the hook for things that we owe to one another. And importantly, I think, the more we're able to do that, the more we're able to see neurodivergent people as agential once we understand the meaning behind their agential activity. Now, these connections between the domains of moral appraisal and access ethics, as I've mentioned, I don't think they're coincidental. Behavioral interpretation and appraisal just is one species of disability access. And so if that's right, the upshot here is this. Even if we reconfigured our social life to make physical spaces, education, the ability to participate in social and political activities, all maximally accessible across body and across neurotype, many disabled people would still be unfairly treated by disproportionately having their behaviors misinterpreted and unfairly appraised. Now, this has just been some agenda setting. I think there's plenty of work to be done in this somewhat under-theorized area of disability justice. And I hope that many of you will sort of take this up with me in working to see how disability and disability access ethics underlies large swaths of significant open moral questions. So thank you.
Thank you, August, for that wonderful presentation. Lots to think about. So if everyone would like to go ahead and place your questions in the Q&A, I will go ahead and ask those. To start, maybe I can ask, oh, actually, never mind. So Jonathan, would you like to start first and then we'll go to Shelley?
Cecilia, if you have a question, I'm happy for you to go.
Oh, no,
first.
go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so it was very interesting to hear about the conflicting requirements of access for people with different types of disability. The area that I've come across this most is I worked for a little bit with an engineer who was trying to work out how to arrange sidewalks for people with disability. And he had an experimental laboratory where he could move all sorts of pavement heights and so on. And he gave up in the end because he thought there was nothing he could do to make street furniture accessible for people, both for people in wheelchairs who needed slopes and graduation, and people who were blind and using sticks to navigate because they needed hard edges and hard surfaces. So this was a very simple sort of mechanical demonstration. And I got very depressed when I heard that because I was optimistic about universal design for that. And the notion of universal design came up this morning. I didn't raise the question. But do you think we should be depressed about universal design, or can we transcend these differences in some way? So what do we do? Do we throw up our hands, or where do we go?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Thank you for that. So I don't know if depressed is the attitude that I want to have towards universal design. I think that universal design is very useful in sort of helping people think about a paradigm shift in terms of the design of spaces. Just trying to make something maximally accessible, even if that can never ultimately, you can never achieve value neutral accessible to all spaces. I think it's going to be a massive improvement to other ways about thinking about design. I will say that I do think that there are probably a lot more of these types of conflicts than many people have wanted there to be because of the optimism. And it is unfortunate. And so I can see how depressed or finding it depressing would be one response to it. I think that it may just be that optimism in my personality, but I think that one thing that addressing these conflicts head on and recognizing them can do is to sort of help shape a different way of relating to people, where instead of thinking about one-off social interactions, so like I'm gonna have this party, how am I gonna make it accessible? We have to start thinking about things as being diachronic and thinking about supporting someone's access over time. So it may not be that every space or every event is able to be accessible to everyone who wants to access it, although caution, we need to use a lot of creativity to try to get us there. But even when we can't, pushing us towards a way of relating to one another, where we're thinking about access needs of our friends and loved ones and community members over time, might be a useful thing. That makes me optimistic to think about what that could look like. So thank you for the question.
Shelley?
Hi, thank you very much for that talk, August. Fantastic. I just wanted to pick up first on the point what you just said about thinking diachronically about access, because I think that one of the things about the criticism that's often made, you know, oh, well, universal access is impossible, is not thinking that way, and thinking of universal access as an end state, in terms of it being an end state, as opposed to it being a process and an ideal to which, you know, one is constantly moving. So
Yes.
So thank you. I wanted to I'm not able to type right now, so I can't search for this, and I would have liked to have searched for it during your talk, but a few years ago, there was I'm pretty sure it was a special issue of the American Philosophical Association newsletter on feminism and philosophy. And there was an article, it was a special issue on Kate Mann's book. And there was an article, perhaps you've read it, an article that took up the sort of issues that you're taking up, or you know, related to them, about and the article was critical of the way that Kate Mann discussed an autistic man's responsibility towards, I think, a sexual assault, and so you might want to see if you can find that, because I think it might be at least interesting, that something that would be interesting to you. Okay,
Absolutely.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Shelley. I have written that down and I fully intend to look for that. That sounds very interesting. And I also appreciate what you said about the value of thinking about universal design as something that we're always striving towards in some sort of way. And maybe the way that we have to do that is by thinking about it as a process and thinking about what it looks like to have, I like the concept of access intimacy. So people who really are kind of get into it with you and understand what your life is like, so that they can support you more fully in a way that doesn't require like listing out my needs. So can I go to this event at this one time? There's something else that we can do here that I'm optimistic about. So I appreciate that sort of push in that direction. Thank you.
Okay, and then we have a few follow-up questions. So one is from ONR, and he states, great line of questioning here, and I appreciate your analysis to the extent I am getting my head around it thus far. I'm wondering if you think the discourse and framing of the idea of access intimacy originating and commonly discussed within disability justice circles may apply here in some way, especially in terms of the And then I got it. So let's just end with that. So because it got cut off.
Oh, I think I see
Do you
it.
want me?
Especially in terms of the practical applications of these ideas. And then says, whoops, I guess you beat me to it. Yes, I wasn't looking at the questions when I mentioned access intimacy. So yes, we are thinking on the same page. I have read some about the concept of access intimacy and want to read more about it from a wider variety of people who've written about it, because I do think that there's something really important here about what true access intimacy could look like, and trying to sort of have the moral imagination, which can be tough, especially when you are a minoritized person, because you've got to work through your own self-stigma to imagine, I think, what it could really look like to have an ethos of access intimacy. Now, there's sort of like a dark side to access intimacy that's worth at least, I think, bringing up, which is that access intimacy requires a pretty significant level of vulnerability that we don't want to force people into. So we don't want our ethos of access intimacy to be sort of pushed on people. That creates just a whole different kind of barrier to our social spaces that we don't want. But I do think that there's something really important about these kinds of genuine connections that I think many of us who are disabled can see the seeds of what that can look like in some of our friendships and interactions with other disabled people, and trying to think about how that could scale up in order to promote access on a larger scale. And on the topic of my talk, sort of how we could take the sorts of things we do in some of our interpersonal one-on-one relationships, like tailoring our expectations and understandings of people we're very close to, and scaling that up to a social level, is something that I'm really excited to think more about. So thank you.
Okay. We also have a question from Ray Briggs, and he asks, I'm curious to hear more about how you see the relationship between disability, which is assumed to entitle you to accommodations, and differences that aren't currently classified as disability, but where the person might still benefit from accommodations. How much we hold current practices fixed when thinking about which accommodations to grant, and how much should we try to frame things in terms of general social benefits versus identity-based rights entitlements?
Oh, great and difficult question. And to take the easy way out of this question, yes, this is something that I think applies to both things, right? Sort of the way we tend to think about access of spaces, and also to requests or wants or needs to modify some way in which we tend to interpret people's behavior and appraise them for it. So the easy way out is to say, yes, we need to think about that, and it applies to both. But I'll try to not just take the easy way out and say something a little bit further. I think that we certainly don't want to take the status quo of whatever we happen to currently classify as a disability, and currently happen to not classify as a disability, as our guiding light in sort of distinguishing. And I believe that so strongly, that's in fact one of the things that motivated me to start thinking about tricky questions in the ethics of access. Because I think once we destigmatize certain kinds of neurodivergence, certain kinds of mental illness, and we see them as sort of clusters of behavioral traits that we've attached certain kinds of significance to, we can then sort of take a more finely grained approach and notice these traits are traits that are shared by other people who don't have a diagnostic label. It makes it then very murky. That said, I have considered, should we just then focus instead on sort of broadly making things accessible without trying to maintain some sort of distinction between this is a disability related kind of access need and just general thing that makes it something more comfortable for people in a broad way. And I don't think at the end of the day that I want to go that way. I do think I want to preserve some sort of distinction between, say, someone who's just got like a really, really strong aesthetic preference, or a really, really strong, I don't know, just a desire for things to be a certain way that's based on a personality trait and neurodiversity or disability related claim. And I don't yet know how to do that, to be fully transparent, but I do think that it is politically valuable for us to maintain some sort of distinction, despite the lots of caution that I have about wanting to demarcate. I do still think we might need to do it. So that's my stab at saying a bit more. So thank you for the tough and important question.
Thank you, August. So I kind of wanted to ask like a follow-up, actually clarificatory maybe question about that, because it seems that often when we talk about disability access, right, and accommodations, to me, the way that I see it is like, who bears the burden, right, of like the hardships that we are all like born with into the world, right? And to a certain extent, like you want to say, well, life is difficult for everybody, right? Regardless of whether or not you're disabled. And so now the question is like, well, whose life is harder, and how do we shift that burden around, kind of stuff, right? And I'm wondering, I mean, do you imagine the end goal being where like everybody shares an equal amount of burden to proportionate to their abilities? Or are you thinking, what is that like utopic world that you work towards?
What a good question. And that's really where I need to go next, I think, is being able to more definitively answer that question. At least that's where I would like to be next. I will say this. Getting closer to equally sharing that burden would probably be an improvement. I don't know that that's really the end state. For one, I don't know that all of the things that matter here are distributive. So I want to put a pin in that. And then even the things that are distributive, it may not be that the goal is an equal amount, in part because we might have duties to redress historical wrongs. We may, here's another factor that might matter. Someone who has an access request, but in order to deal with a space that's not accessible, or to deal with a norm that doesn't really fit them, it's kind of like a minor inconvenience, but it happens all the time, such that that person just doesn't want to deal with that kind of social space anymore. Are we counting up the amount of burden, or are we counting up what tips someone over so that they don't want to participate? So I just think it's going to end up being more complicated than something we could say by equal amount of burden. But I do think that would be better. And I do think that people who would consider themselves neurotypical probably haven't taken on enough of that burden currently. So that move is better. Pushing some of the burden and redistributing it is better, but it might not be all that matters, and it probably isn't. Thanks.
Thank you. And then so Sigrid Strix has a question. Thank you so much, August, for this incredibly inspiring talk. Regarding your point about the politics of disclosure, I was wondering whether the early implementation of an ethics of access caused a demand for disclosure of diagnosis. Could you please elaborate on how this impacts destigmatization? And if I can add, potential conflicts between requests for access and then not wanting to disclose.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So I've thought about this in regards to my claims that we ought to shift some of our interpretational norms. And I've thought, could we have it be that we kind of require people to know about the vast variety of ways that people's minds function in the world, such that they have to keep all of those possibilities open every time they're interpreting someone's behavior? This seems a little bit outlandish to me, because there's just going to be just too high of a cognitive load to actually do that task. But that's kind of the other end from requiring people to disclose the way their particular mind functions. So I don't think either of those extremes is great. The requiring people to disclose is a problem, because that comes with all sorts of costs in the current society. And I think that's put nicely in this question about the early implementation. One thing I do think that we could do is push for some sort of general norm of disclosure, much in the same way that people have pushed for mentioning your pronouns, right? Even if you're a cis person, makes it so that it's a little bit easier to disclose your pronouns when you're a trans person. Something like that, some sort of general norm where you might not even be disclosing a diagnosis, but you're disclosing important features about how to interpret your behavior that may come up, would be something that might help bridge that gap until we're kind of further down the road of destigmatizing things, so that people feel more comfortable sharing. So I do think there are actually things we could do in the near term to help with that problem. Will there be bumps in the road in getting there? Yes, unfortunately. That's sort of just the way it goes, I think. And there are going to be these unfortunate trade-offs, and disabled people are going to bear more of the burden in reality, in our imperfect world, by having to make tough decisions about disclosure in order to get the things they want. Should it be that way? No. Do I think it will be that way? Perhaps.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we are out of time for this session. Thank you all for joining us. I think this was a really great session, great discussion, really interesting points. I'm sorry if we didn't get to everyone's questions. I will pass those on to August, and then hopefully he will be able to respond. And I will see you all, or later, or have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much,
August,
everyone. I really appreciate it.
August, I just wanted to mention that I had mentioned about thinking of universal access as a process, and
Yes.
you might want to take a look at it if you're, if you want to follow up on this. Margaret Price, I believe in their book, Mad at School, talks about conceiving universal design as a way to move. So that's something.
Excellent. Thank you. I have that book in my pile of to read soon. So I will move it to the top. Thank you.
Okay.